issued his encyclical Humani Generis, which rather grudgingly allowed that we need to explore the evolution of the human body and other kinds of life, but didn't really get excited about it. But we didn't have to wait until 1996 and Pope John Paul's explicit declaration that the evidence for evolution is very strong and the Catholics need to pay attention to it. Already in 1962 to 65, the Second Vatican Council had made these observations and recommendations. So where did these ideas come from? I'm sure that many of you know the answer to this, but probably many of you do not. I think, without being too simplistic about it, most of them came, not exclusively, but for the most part, from one man, the Jesuit Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And as I say, there are a lot of ironies involved here. Teilhard was born in France in 1881, for those of you who are not familiar with him. And he died in the United States working for the Museum of American History in 1955. He was, as I say, a Jesuit priest, and by profession, he was a geologist and paleontologist, therefore steeped in evolutionary thinking. And from the time he was still a very young man, he started working on the question that preoccupied him his whole life, and that's how to integrate science and his faith. And he wrote some papers when he was still very young, which seemed to his superiors to be just a bit too adventurous for the time. So to get him out of the European theater, where he was already becoming controversial, they shipped him off to China, which is not the place to send people who like to dig up old bones, because while he was there, he developed a sterling scientific reputation, becoming one of the top 2 or 3 geologists of Asia, and very widely respected among scientists. But he was also, at the same time that he was there for over a quarter of a century, he was also beginning to write some major works which were not allowed to be published in his own lifetime, especially The Phenomenon of Man, which is now translated in English as The Human Phenomenon, which became his most important work eventually. He was working on it, but could not get his superiors or the Vatican to give him permission to publish it. So, to make a long story short, he died very much alone and unknown in New York in 1955 on Easter Sunday, and is buried in upstate New York and Poughkeepsie. After he died, his religious writings, he died in 1955, began to exercise a profound impact on religious thought, including Catholic theology. So that by the time of the Second Vatican Council in 1962 to 1965, many of the periti, or the experts at the council, had become familiar with Teilhard's works. They advised the bishops and others who were writing the documents of the Second Vatican Council, including Gaudium et Spes, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. And what's really ironic, incidentally, at the end of the council in 1967, Henri de Lubac, who was one of the best known and also at the time of his theological career somewhat controversial, but by the end of the council, de Lubac had been completely rehabilitated as a mainline Catholic thinker. But in 1967, 2 years after the council, de Lubac said that Gaudium et Spes, that Second Vatican Council document, accomplished, in his words, precisely what Teilhard wanted. And de Lubac was not the only one to say this. Robert Pharisee, an expert on Teilhard, says that Teilhard exercised a dominant influence on the shaping of Gaudium et Spes. And what I say when I say it's ironic is that in 1962, the Holy Office of the Vatican issued a monitum, a warning, which they sent to the heads of seminaries and Catholic colleges and universities, warning them not to let their students be exposed to what the Monitum called the dangerous ideas of Teilhard de Chardin. This was in 1962, the same year the council began. But by 1965, Teilhard's thought had become virtually, I don't want to exaggerate here, but virtually, at least in many respects, official Catholic teaching. To understand Gaudium et Spes, to understand much of the Second Vatican Council, I personally think we have to dig into Teilhard's own ideas once again. Or if you've never explored them before, it's, I think, illuminating to see what this man was saying at the time. He agreed with the traditional hierarchical view, which we talked about earlier, that that religious people, and Catholics he's talking about in particular, need to have a sense of communion with God. So he doesn't throw all that away. He's not throwing tradition away. He appreciates the fervor, the longing for God that all those pre-Copernican and pre-Darwinian centuries cultivated. However, he thought that it refers to a God who's so much up above the world that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it brings about an impulse on the part of religious people to escape from the world, to escape from nature, to escape from the responsibilities even for human history. This is one very powerful religious calling that's still very much around. And since Vatican II, I think personally that in many ways it's gotten even stronger. But there's also science. Science came along, and what science tells us, Teilhard says, not explicitly necessarily, but implicitly, is that something exciting, something interesting, something important is going on in this world, and it opens up a new horizon of expectation, which had long been part of humanism, Marxism, and other forms of ways of organizing our understanding of the world. But science tells us that we live, and this is Teilhard's main idea, and he comes back to it again and again, that we live in a universe that's still coming into being. Creation was not completed on day one. Every day, now as much as in the beginning, the world is raised further above nothingness. And what we have to feel in our bones, and what the great value of science for spirituality is that each day the Big Bang is still happening. It's no less momentous an event today than it was 13.8 billion years ago. So clearly science is telling us that this world has a future. So a new horizon of expectation and hope arises because of science, but also because of other developments in the modern world. And these can be very dangerous too. Teilhard cautions us. The naturalistic temptation is to say, well, let's forget about the divine, the transcendent altogether. Nature is exciting enough, nature is rich enough, it's enormous enough and immense enough and resourceful enough. Why would we want to look anywhere else than to nature to find the fulfillment of the deepest spiritual longings of humanity? This gives rise to what Teilhard calls, and other people call, the naturalistic temptation, the belief that nature is all there is. That's problematic because science itself tells us that eventually, maybe it'll be a long time from now, maybe it'll be billions, maybe trillions of years from now, the universe will die of energy exhaustion. And everything that has been accomplished in this process, including the great chapter of awakening of consciousness that has taken place recently in the world's evolution, will go down the pit of the abyss of nothingness. And as William James put it very classically, the meaning of materialism, if you face up to it, the meaning of a pure naturalist materialism is that ultimately nothing, absolutely nothing, will remain of all that has been accomplished in this cosmic process. Now, this is something that Teilhard and many of the rest of us find very difficult to accept. And even on ethical grounds, the question is whether if we truly believed that the world is headed toward absolute death, if we really believe that in our deepest heart of hearts, what implication, what impact would that have on our moral life here and now? So the naturalistic temptation is not satisfactory either. Neither was the withdrawal, the escapist one. But the idea that nature is all there is, if you think it out fully, is not very motivating either. What's the point, is the question. So Teilhard proposes that to sustain our hopes, and he believes, like many other religious thinkers do, that you really will not have a vigorous set of motives for true moral action unless you also have some sense of hope for the future. To sustain our hopes, evolution must have a goal. And he suggests that the way in which we can think of God, therefore, is not so much as God up above, but as God up ahead. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So we have three possibilities. We have the possibility of communion with God and the possibility of communion with the earth or communion with nature. Two different kinds of spirituality. But there's a third possibility. We can have communion with God through nature, through becoming involved in nature. And this is what the council meant. I'm sure when they said that present incentives for moral action can actually be intensified by an evolutionary worldview. We can have communion with God through the earth. And this, I believe, lies behind Vatican II. And I think we don't really understand that document unless we understand the kind of thinking that went into its shaping. To come back to the problem with a pure naturalism, let me just quote Teilhard here. Promise the earth 100 million more years of continued growth. In terms of contemporary cosmology, I think he would say trillions of years of continued growth. If at the end of that period, no matter how long, it is evident that the whole of consciousness must revert to zero, without its secret essence being garnered anywhere at all. And here, of course, he's referring to one of the attributes of God, namely to preserve in the divine memory and compassion everything that has happened in cosmic process, not just in human life, but the whole cosmic story, which we now realize is so intricately stitched into the making of minds. As Teilhard put it elsewhere, to make a soul, God has to first make a universe, as it were. So the whole cosmic process is talking about, with that, if its secret essence is not garnered and preserved anywhere, then, he says, I insist, we shall lay down our arms. In other words, we won't have sufficient motivation. It reminds me of something that Václav Havel said not too long before he died, the president of the Czech Republic, that the biggest problem of global irresponsibility today, he says, is that we've lost the sense that the universe has a purpose. And I think that's a very Teilhardian idea. Anyway, Teilhard goes on to say, the prospect of a total death, which is what astrophysics predicts, eventually the Big Bang will die out in a big crunch, or it'll freeze. The freeze or fry possibilities. I warn you, when it has become part of our consciousness, will immediately dry up in us the springs, by which he means the motivations, from which our efforts are drawn. I don't know what your own thoughts on this are. I completely agree with him on this point, that we can fully love the universe. In other words, you can really only be a true naturalist only if it is saved everlastingly. We can truly love only that which is eternal and everlasting. So then, what does worship mean in the age of science? Teilhard's words here were not repeated